That's not working either.
The U.S., like virtually every other place on Earth, is suffering from unprecedented and dangerous weather events. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, recorded a record 28 of what they call billion-dollar 492 deaths.
I think Ken is going to log back in momentarily and see if we can solve his technical problems. There he is.
That was the strangest thing. I just got logged off and came back. So, and I hope no one heard me curse while I was being logged off.
You were frozen.
I was frozen, right? Apologies. I'll finish this up. So NOAA reported that these storms led directly to 492 deaths, but we know that these events have far greater health and mortality effects than what is reported in the immediate aftermath of major weather events. It's difficult to quantify the impact of extreme weather on premature mortality, but it's clear that the incidents and impacts of climate change are rising every year. And as always, the impact of social distress falls unequally on the poor and disadvantaged. And according to our guest today, particularly on older adults. In mass disasters like Katrina, older adults who are often less mobile and have less resources than other groups accounted for a full 2/3 of all deaths. And it's not an outlier. Older adults are often risked due to the impact of extreme weather events on complex medical conditions and the interruption of necessary power, medical supplies, and caregiving services. In her wonderful and timely book, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation, Danielle Arigoni argues that we cannot achieve true resilience until communities adopt interventions that work to meet the needs of their oldest residents. She explains to us that when we plan for those most impacted by climate and for those with the greatest obstacles to opportunity and well-being, we improve conditions for all. A little bit about Danielle. She's currently the Managing Director for Policy and Solutions at the National Housing Trust, where she provides strategic direction for the organization's sustainability and resilience policy efforts. Before joining the trust in 2022, she served as Director of Livable Communities AARP, where she designed and implemented a robust and supportive AARP's network of 600 communities and 53 state offices to advance more effective housing, transportation, disaster resilient, and public space decision-making. Thanks to you, Danielle, for joining us today. I'm going to turn this over to Martha. Before I do, I want to remind everyone that we want your questions starting now in the Q&A function. Producer Kate will be sifting through them and forward them onto the panel. Martha,
thanks, Ken.
Take it away.
Thanks, Ken, and thank you, Danielle, for joining us. I was going to say this morning, but I guess it's now this afternoon. I confess, I've been studying, issues of long lives for 15 years, and we talked about the impact of climate and climate change on young people. But until I heard a Stanford professor a year or so ago, Professor Elliott White, talk about how Katrina disproportionately impacted people of color and older people, it didn't occur to me that this is an issue that we really need to be thinking about with an aging population. How did it get on your radar? I feel like I'm late to the game.
Well, first of all, thank you, Martha and Ken and others for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here and talk with y'all today. You're not alone. If you feel like you're late to the game, I would say this is one of those, the biggest sort of unremarked upon tragedies that's unfolding before our eyes. It just doesn't seem to break through either in the aging world or in the climate world. And it's really what compelled me to write the book. How I arrived at the challenge, I think it's been an evolution. I'm an urban planner. I came out of that field, worked in the federal government most of my career. And my last position in the federal government well, I would say all of my positions in the federal government were about how you can modify land use and make better policy investments around land use that deliver more equitable outcomes and better community outcomes. And at the time, we were largely focused on low-income communities, communities of color, disadvantaged communities. It wasn't really until but a large part of that was around climate resilience as well. How could we ensure that climate resilience and disaster recovery benefits the people who are most impacted by it, low-income people and communities of color? It wasn't until I got to AARP that I began to see I recognize my own blind spots, frankly, about how the needs of older adults didn't often get considered in that equation. And, the overlap between age and income and race, it compounds those risks. It doesn't eliminate them or mitigate them. And I think that by applying an aging lens, I really became aware of the many ways in which older adults' needs are not being considered in how we design our built environment, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the disaster rates from climate, the fatality rates from climate fueled disasters that you started to talk about, Ken. And I distinctly remember a group from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy coming and talking to us at AARP and revealing some of these statistics, and I was just bowled over by them. And that really sat with me, and I think it ended up being kind of an opportunity to fuse together the work that I had done in the federal government on climate resilience, as well as the work that we did at AARP to think about how older adults' needs manifest in a better built environment, and bring all those pieces together so that we could sort of bring these two worlds together. Because your experience, Martha, of not thinking about the connection or not thinking about that intersection is shockingly common.
So given the number of climate events that we're all familiar with, when I was reading the book, I'm like, I live near the campfire. Why do you think there's such a vacuum of information around this? Or why do you think there isn't this kind of lens that the data would suggest there should be?
Yeah. Well, one thing that surprised me in doing the research for the book is that we almost always knew about these impacts. Articles about the Camp Fire and about the fires in Oregon and the winter storms and Katrina and Hurricane Ida and all of them, Hurricane Maria. Almost always news stories include a little tidbit in there about the ages of people who died. Usually it's kind of towards the bottom. It's very rarely the headline. It wasn't until Hurricane Ian, frankly, in Florida in 2022 that I saw a headline that really sought to dig into why was it that so many older adults died in this disaster. And I was like, finally, someone's paying attention. But as to the question, why isn't it breaking through? I think partially, honestly, it reflects our ageism as a country. We don't like to talk about aging. Aging is not a topic of conversation in most circles. It is this year with our presidential candidates, obviously, in that doesn't necessarily deliver a very positive opportunity to talk about aging. It ends up being talked about as a risk or as an impairment, not as a process that is something we'll all go through. There's no shortage of anti-aging strategies, but we don't talk about aging in a healthy way. And I think that's part of why we seemed unwilling to, as a country, kind of really confront this fact that older adults are disproportionately impacted. I think another reason, frankly, is because it kind of straddles two worlds. In some sense, there's a climate resilience world that is very focused on mitigating climate impacts and adapting to a changing climate for everyone, very broadly. And then there's an aging world that is minding the shop on what it means for our country as we age, with a growing cohort, a growing share of older adults. They're not necessarily focused on climate change, and the climate change people aren't necessarily focused on age. And so no one's really sitting at that intersection. And I think it almost ends up feeling like a crevasse that this issue has kind of gotten lost in, because it's no one agency's, it's no one department's job to solve this problem.
Yeah, I think I was struck as I was reading the book about, there was one section where you actually sort of named all of the agencies that have various tools to evaluate and eliminate risk, and how they're not connected, or they don't necessarily talk about the same things.
Yeah, perfect example. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration Agency, which is responsible for overseeing the state hazard mitigation plan process. So that is the fundamental means by which states and in some cases localities develop plans to mitigate their risk. They just updated their guidance last year. And while they had sort of a bit more on the understanding the importance of demographics, they still weren't explicit in saying you need to understand the ages of your population and what their needs are as it relates to the risks that you just spent the last 50 or 100 pages describing. So, and what that results in is a very cursory analysis, frankly, of older adults' needs, or a very cursory discussion of their needs. Often, what I observed is that the people writing those plans feel as if they've checked the box because they've accounted for the assisted living facilities and the nursing homes. They're like, we talked about nursing homes, good, we're done. We've solved the need for older adults. That's just not true. I mean, that's 2.5% of the older adult population. The vast majority of older adults live in the community outside of those facilities. So it's just, again, a missed opportunity, some of which relates to the agency's mandates, but nevertheless, that with intention and with education, I think there are a lot of opportunities for federal agencies to guide towards a better outcome.
So are the tides turning? No pun intended. Is it becoming part of the discussion, mainstream discussion, or is it still kind of the edges?
I'm going to say it's still at the edges. I do see signs of hope, and I don't mean to sound, navel gazing here, but I do hear signs of hope when I talk about people who I know who are in the administration, who are in leadership positions, who say, I read your book, and when I did that trip to Hawaii to talk to local leaders, I asked them about the plight of older adults. So, I see people walking away from maybe reading the book or listening to a talk with at least the desire to ask the question, how did this impact older adults differently? How are you thinking about older adults' needs? How do you define older adults? That gives me hope, but I also just see the enormity of the challenge and the complexity of our federal government and how you really center age in that. There's a lot of work to be done, and that's just the federal level, not to mention the local and state levels.
So Danielle, let me ask you this. You said something about how do you define older adults? And someone just said, "Hey, how do you define older adults?"
We're on the same page.
We are great minds. So how do we? It's a huge, if you say 65 plus, it's a huge and diverse population.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about older adults, both in your book and to policymakers, who are you really talking about, and what are their risks?
Yeah, I would say, well, I'll answer the first question first on defining this group. I think that's been part of the problem, is that we have a lot of different definitions for what it means to be an older adult. ARP starts sending membership information at age 50. At age 55 is when you qualify for the retirement community, or maybe discounted movie tickets, or cheap gym membership here in the county where I live. 62 is when you qualify for Social Security, 67 for Medicare. The ages are all over the place. We have lots of different ages to mark different thresholds, if you will, for aging. And I think that's part of the problem. Unlike youth, which clearly ends at age 18, we don't really have a clear definition for what it means to when someone becomes an older adult. And that therefore yields a lot of different mismatched data. So sometimes the data is reported out on people who are age 60 and over, sometimes it's 65 and over. For purposes of my book, I primarily focus on people 65 and over. But sometimes data is only available for 60 plus or 70 plus. So it really does vary. The other thing about that, and I think what you allude to, Ken, is that there's so much variety in that cohort alone. From 65 to the end of life, the needs are so wildly different, and they change rapidly, which is another reason that I think older adults on their own merit special focus and attention. This is where you start to see people being unable to drive and being unable to remain independently mobile. This is where you see people starting to have higher rates of dementia, cognitive decline. This is where you see people living with multiple chronic conditions, medical conditions. And that's why that and many reasons more are why I really think that we need to kind of dig in and understand what older adults are confronted with, because those are the preconditions that they bring then to the climate risks that they face, that you really can't separate them. You can't divorce those two things.
When you were talking with Martha, it was a little bit of older adults are outside the conversation. No one's thinking about them. But are there also myths about their resiliency and ability to respond to climate change that inhibits success in this area?
Yeah, I think there are. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or characterization of their abilities. I think, to the point of the sort of default setting that people think if they've planned for the needs of older adults in nursing homes, they're done, not recognizing the vast majority, the overwhelming majority that don't live in those congregate facilities. I don't think that people realize that that many people live in the community. I don't think that people realize that 30% of older adults live alone. And these are people who may no longer be in the workforce. They may be unable to leave their home. They may literally not see another human being for days or weeks at a time. But for the home-based care that's delivered, or but for neighbors who happen to live close by. I think there's also a very poor understanding of the financial situation that many adults find themselves in. Just late last year, the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies released their occasional report on the housing needs of older adults. They found that the housing cost burden rate among older adults, and that means older adults who pay 30% or more of their income on housing, that has reached an all-time high. And we see one of every two renter households who are led by an older adult being housing cost burdened. So the financial strain is real. Even among older homeowners, 1 in 4 are housing cost burdened. So again, there's a preconception. If you own your home, you must be fine. That's not true. The housing costs have really hit everyone. They reach everyone. And they certainly impact older adults. And when someone is struggling to make their basic ends meet, it really gets in the way of their ability to stockpile food and medicine to be prepared for a disaster. It certainly impacts their ability to relocate for a few days or a week at a time if they have to get out of harm's way. Think about the wildfire risk, or extreme weather, or if power goes out. Some people can easily decamp to a hotel and ride out the storm, but for older adults who are financially strained, they can't. And that doesn't even begin to talk about the sort of other housing related costs with insurance and utilities that we can probably get into. But so I think, financial, I think physical, mental health, the chronic conditions that people are living with, I think those and many other reasons are what puts older adults particularly at risk.
So when I was reading the book and thinking about some of the challenges, it's hard to ignore the fact that a lot of the extreme weather conditions exist in places like Florida, which also have a high percentage of older people, and also a high percentage of what's called climate resistors, who may not be as focused as other constituencies on the impact of climate change on communities and on health. Is that a particular problem that we face, that intersectionality of all those factors?
It definitely is. I mean, it breaks my heart a little bit every time I think about the sort of the latest real estate reports that come out that show the highest areas of growth are the Sun Belt and the Southwest and the coastal areas. I think about last summer in Phoenix, where we had something like 6 weeks of 100+ degree days consistently, and yet Arizona is like one of the fastest growing states for older adults. It's just this cognitive dissonance I find around what climate risk really means for older adults, and economic choices that people are making about where to live. I think that even for people who may be climate deniers, as we'll say, or climate resistors, I think they're starting to become a more of an awareness about the impacts of climate change, and that's largely related to home insurance and the value of their homes. I mean, what we are seeing is, even among the most rabid climate denier, if your insurance premiums are going to quadruple in the next few years, it doesn't really matter whether you believe in climate or not. That the impact is hitting in a very real way, and it's going to cause you to think, can you afford to stay in this place? Is it financially safe for me to do so? The downside and terrible part of that is what you see is people unable to afford insurance, and therefore really in harm's way. And I'm reflecting on a call, frankly, that I just got a few weeks ago from someone in Ventura County, California, who runs the community foundation there. And she reached out to say that the atmospheric rivers that hovered over California for most of December and January really impacted parts of Ventura. And in this particular case, over 3 hours, no, I'm sorry, 45 minutes, 3 inches of rain fell. It was something crazy. And it largely impacted about 500 houses in this one community, most of which were occupied by low-income people, older adults, and undocumented people. And the reality is that none of those people had flood insurance. They weren't in a flood zone per se, but they are unable to recover now because the cost of rehabilitating their homes is too much for them to handle. There are no public resources that are adequate to the task. The event was too small to trigger FEMA relief coming in. Mm-hmm. And the only resource that the federal government would offer was small business assistance loans. But older adults wouldn't qualify for those because they live on fixed incomes and they can't accommodate the additional payments of a loan on a fixed income. So they're really left high and dry. So again, back to the sort of, what is going to cause climate deniers to really confront this reality. I think it's going to be those kinds of things. It's going to be when it hits their financial pocketbook, or when they find that the strain and duress of living through hurricane season after hurricane season is not delivering the quality of life that they want for themselves.
Yeah. So I did see the notion that I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat if you're interested. I saw someone raise their hand. We don't have a way to respond to raised hands, so the only way to get your questions is if you put it in the chat. So Danielle, it seems it's a tough subject, perhaps a depressing subject to spend years digging into. Is there advice you offer? You're going to talk to Martha a little bit in a few minutes about sort of social policy and community policy, but on an individual basis, for homeowner or for older people, what kind of advice do you offer them as they think about their own futures?
Yeah, I mean, the good news, and there is good news. This is a heavy topic, and there's a lot of doom and gloom in it. I think that there's a lot of good news. One is we have more data at our fingertips than we've ever had before in terms of being able to understand and project the climate risks that we face at the household level and at the community level. So I would really encourage people to think about asking those questions. What are the climate risks that I face where I live now? How able is my home? How much could, with this home that I live in, withstand those risks? And what are enhancements that I could make to possibly mitigate my risks? That might mean, backup power. In some cases, if you are living in an area that's going to have more power outages, it might mean air purifiers. If you live in an area where wildfire smoke is becoming far more common, it might mean elevating your home. Frankly, if you live in an area that's increasingly exposed to flooding. Another bit of good news is that there's more funds available from the federal government to make homes more climate resilient than ever before. That is largely rolling out through, rebates that encourage people to adopt technologies in their homes that reduce energy consumption, or that switch to renewable energies away from fossil fuels. Those kinds of things can, in fact, reduce risk for older adults. So when you have a power stable supply, you have cleaner energy powering your home. There are also resources to localities to invest in resilience that can bolster community resilience and hopefully eliminate some of that risk. So I would say understand your risks, see what actions you can take as to modify your home in particular, but then also, don't be afraid to bring up the topic of climate change with your doctor or with your caregiver or with the home healthcare worker who comes and visits your home. We haven't typically, I think, made climate change a part of a medical checkup, but I think we probably need to. It's probably time to start talking about what living in Phoenix and 6 weeks of 100+ weather days means for older adults, and what it means for the risks that they already face with regards to heart disease or cardiovascular disease that they live with every day. That's not just a Phoenix problem. Every part of the country really is encountering new conditions that I think intersect with a lot of those the pre-existing medical conditions that older adults live with that could benefit from a conversation with the doctor.
So, I would say observationally that people don't like to think about the worst case scenarios. It's hard to do that. And we have a question we have a question from the audience about how we raise awareness about climate change, particularly among isolated older adults who may have much more immediate needs than planning for extreme weather. So how do you deal with that conversation?
I think there's a couple ways. One, I think first, in doing interviews for this book and related work over the years, it was brought to my attention that there's a whole network of home healthcare aides who are routinely going to people's homes. Same with Meals on Wheels delivery or volunteer services of that kind. Same with villages. Villages is a concept that helps people age in place, where they have volunteers that can help older adults with basic needs. So all of those are these kind of informal, in some cases, networks of people who can reach people who are otherwise quite isolated. And I think, again, we have not tasked those entities, nor have we asked those people to talk about climate change with the people that they're supporting. I think there's an opportunity to do that. That is one way to reach people who are isolated, is to figure out who is it that actually is making their way into the home, and how can you use that service delivery or that touch point as a way of talking about climate risks and maybe helping them find their way to solutions. For better, for worse, a lot of these solutions were piloted during COVID. We also found there that a lot of isolated people, needed to be reached in different ways. It wasn't enough to just put up a Twitter post or to do a town hall and expect people to get the information they needed. So what we're seeing, and particularly one of the case studies I talked about in Portland, they repurposed some of those infrastructure, some of those programs that reached isolated people in ways that they felt comfortable with, repurpose them to sort of solve for climate risks. The one example that I think is so great is, Portland and the Pacific Northwest experienced a pretty dire heat wave in 2021. 1,000 people died. They realized that they needed to get portable air conditioners into the homes of people who are at greatest risk. And they ended up going through trusted intermediaries, in some cases sort of culturally relevant groups, Hispanic serving groups, African-American serving groups, Asian groups, to reach people who, again, they knew how to communicate with them. They knew how to get in touch with them. They were already trusted. They'd already had the experience of serving older adults' needs during COVID. They ended up using some of those same connections to get those portable air conditioners into people's homes. So there are a lot of ways to reach isolated people. And the other thing is, I would say, and I often say, is community resilience is also about building communities that don't enable that sort of isolation. So how do we create housing that puts people in closer proximity to one another? The vast majority of our housing stock right now is single family detached homes. That doesn't necessarily facilitate a lot of connectedness across neighbors, particularly on large lots. So what are some options that you see in terms of housing design that can solve for that isolation at the get-go?
So I'm curious about that, Danielle, how you think about that, because you're surely right about that, but all sort of the social indices seem to point in the opposite direction. Our social capital is declining. Resistance to multifamily housing in communities, it's always high. But do you see any trends that are, let's put a positive spin on it, are favorable in that regard?
I do, actually. I see a lot. I think that the housing crisis has gotten bad enough that it has begun to shift people's thinking. Now, that's not going to say that every NIMBY out there has got religion and all of a sudden wants a multifamily building in their backyard. That's not the case. But what we are seeing is a lot of political leadership willing to push through that opposition in ways that they didn't before or were unwilling to before, in the pursuit of generating more housing units, because they know that the housing crisis is an existential threat to their community. So we see waves of zoning reform happening across the country, in California, Oregon, Washington, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Connecticut, New Jersey. A number of states have overhauled the way they think about land use and are enabling better construction and more easy construction of things like accessory dwelling units, which is a way to build a small attached or detached home adjacent to a primary. It's an ideal solution for older adults, particularly if you are a person like me who maybe has an older parent and you want them close to you, but they still want to retain their independence. If you can build an ADU and keep them out of a nursing home and keep closer watch on them, that's a great solution. It's also a great solution for older adult who wants to build one for themselves, move into the smaller home out back, rent out their primary home, and then they're bolstering their financial cash flow. And I could go on and on for the benefits of ADUs, but we're seeing a lot of that kind of zoning reform happening, which gives me hope that there actually is a hunger for creating communities that foster more of that social connection.
So I want to ask one more question. Martha,
Go
did
ahead,
you?
Ken. I was going to go ahead.
All right. So I wanted to, so I was gonna say, I want to ask one more question, then turn it back over to Martha. So I'm gonna cling to that one question. A lot of what you said, Danielle, seems to suggest that the real levers on government are financial ones, and that when governments see the costs go up, that's when they respond to some of these challenges. Is that your sense? And what is really getting attention of decision makers now?
That's a great question. I think at the end of the day, I don't mean to be crass, but I do think that that is probably what carries the day in most communities, and that crosses political ideology. If something is going to be seen as strengthening the economic future for that community or that population, I think it's has a better chance of being successful. So to the degree that we can put things in a positive financial frame, that's great, which is the case certainly for things like energy efficiency investments and the like, where you know that investing in a property is going to save money down the way. I think the real challenge with climate resilience work is that it doesn't always result in that payoff, that very clear income stream to a community. And it's difficult to quantify what it's going to cost if we don't invest in resilience. But I do think there is an understanding, I think, particularly the degree that community members are asking for it, older adults, not just older adults, young people as well, you need to lean on local officials to say, what is it that you're doing in all the decisions that you touch that can reduce risk for our people? And I argue that, start by asking, how does it reduce risk for older adults? If there's an investment that you can make in public transit or in communication systems or alarm systems, alert systems, that's going to reduce risk for older adults, that's probably a good bet, because it's also going to benefit a lot of other people. But use older adults as that test, because if you're solving for their needs, you're solving for the needs of other low-income people, of other people with disabilities, of other people who don't speak English as a first language, of other people who are mobility impaired. So again, I do think there are a lot of opportunities for local leaders to make better decisions, whether they're motivated by finances or other means.
Martha, I'm actually curious as I turn it over to you. I want to ask you, so your observations. So you live, as you mentioned, in a community that is exposed to significant climate risks, and you spend a lot of time thinking about the challenges of older communities. Do you see your community responding to some of these elevated risks for older people?
Not as much as we'd like. And I live in a denser part of the county than particularly we're at fire risk. The recent conversation in the media has been around the insurance question, as insurers are leaving California and canceling policies. One of our local newspapers really put a light on that with regards to people with fixed incomes who, even if they can find an alternative insurer, won't be able to afford the premiums. And it was also mentioned in the chat, one of our attendees who's from Canada sort of made the point about how the housing insecurity for older persons based on home insurance is a great risk. And, Canada's going through their own set of climate crises at the moment too. So before Danielle, I wanted to ask you to provide your definition for resilience of an aging population, aging nation, because I looked at it. I again, you had some interconnecting bubbles that I think are really important to pinpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's thinking differently about how I'm a planner, so I come back to how we plan our communities. What are the land use decisions that are being made that sort of shape our built environment? how are we thinking about sort of community health? And that means both the aging of our population and, kind of investments that really think about, are we creating healthy communities for everyone's needs, for people of all ages? And then really honing in on the climate risks and what are the unique climate risks that that community has. And I think when you bring all those three things together, you kind of get this climate resilience notion in the middle. But one of the things that I often challenge, climate resilience or climate adaptation planners to think about is that it's not just about the seawalls. It's not just about the wildland urban interface and making sure that that creates a fire barrier. It's not just about the hard infrastructure and the levees. It's just as much about how we're designing and developing our homes, what kind of transportation networks we have to help people on a daily basis and during emergencies. It's about, a better approach among utilities to delivering power, ensuring safe and secure power, affordable power, renewable power. It requires more of a focus on communication and an attention to how we're communicating with people and supporting communication among people so that those social networks can be playing the role that we know they so critically play in many cases, and much more. Like there's kind of really a role for many different sectors in achieving climate resilience.
When Ken, Kate, and I were prepping for this call, we were talking about, you make a point about the social infrastructure and social connection as kind of an important piece of this puzzle, and how we talk about that almost with every author, regardless of the topic, the growing importance of, community infrastructure, social connections, kind of knowing your neighbors is really pivotal to a lot of these conversations.
Absolutely.
So who is doing this well? Are there examples of communities or countries or regions that?
Yeah. The country's question, I'm eager to find an answer to. To be honest, I haven't. That if I were to, win the lottery tomorrow, I would start writing a second book, and I would focus on understanding what other countries are doing well, because I do think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Japan and places like that have been confronting both a much older population already, even far exceeding our growth rate, and as well as crises. In the case of Japan, it's tsunamis and earthquakes, but they've had to develop response systems that are applicable, I think, to the challenges we face with climate change. But I did focus on and found a few communities here in the country, in the US, that are doing some interesting work. I've talked about Portland already. I think that is really unique in their ability to leverage a prior commitment that they had made to planning for older adults and to be able to pivot that into facing climate challenges. So one of the planning frameworks that exists in the US and around the world is an age-friendly network. It was first developed by the World Health Organization many years ago. Here in the US, AARP has adopted that framework and now manages it. But Portland, Oregon was among the first to join the World Health Organization network. And what that meant is they were committing to themselves to becoming an age-friendly community. That's not like a destination that you arrive at. It's a process that you kind of commit to continuing to work on. But what it does is it situates the needs of older adults right smack in front of decision makers. And it does that by bringing diverse stakeholders to the table who often don't have a say in housing decisions or transportation choices, but now are there to represent the needs of older adults and make sure that their needs are considered. So that prior commitment in Portland was, again, able to be leveraged when they wanted to confront their new challenges, which was climate change, and in particular the response to the heat waves. They were aided and supported by the fact that, and what makes them a kind of a unique and replicable example, is that a lot of the age-friendly work in the city complemented the work that was happening at the county level. And in this case, the county level was important because they both house the emergency response responsibilities, the emergency management responsibility. So all the people who are out there planning for disasters sit in county. So too does the area agency on aging, who are responsible for delivering services to older adults. It's the Meals on Wheels services. It's all the Older American Act funded services. Those two entities didn't necessarily work together or talk to one another, even though they both sat at the county. But through this age-friendly framework that Portland had adopted, it brought them together to really talk about how they could leverage each other's contributions and work. And one of the examples is that, example of deploying the portable air conditioners in the face of heat waves. I would also point to New Orleans, which, it has been on the ropes time and time again with climate fuel disasters. It seems that every year there's one or two or three that really sets them back. They are not an age-friendly community per se. That's not to say they don't care about their older adults, but they have really morphed, I would say, or what I learned is they've morphed their approach to disaster response over the last 20 years. So whereas in Katrina, the focus was on getting people out of harm's way and, moving them to, in some cases, Texas, getting them, relocating temporarily or for the midterm, for several months in some cases, or years even. They've kind of shifted their focus. And what I hear them talking about now is how can we enable people to stay in place and withstand power outages that we know are going to come. So that's really warranted a different set of techniques and set of policies, frankly. One example that I'll point to that I think is really interesting and tragic is that they realize that, in the face of extended power outages after I think it was Hurricane Ian or perhaps Ida, they lost power for like 2 or 3 weeks in some cases. So for older adults who live in multi-family buildings, so multi-story buildings, live on upper floors, normally you would say this is a great solution. It's compact, it's dense, your neighbors. In this case, because they had no backup power, the elevator stopped working. And these, in some cases, were mobility impaired people who couldn't use the stairs. So they became effectively trapped for weeks. And that actually led to 8 deaths, deaths that would not have otherwise occurred. So that was a big wake-up call for New Orleans. They passed new policy to say, if you've got a critical mass of older adults living in your building, you need to have some basic backup power in place. Mm-hmm. So again, I think New Orleans is a wonderful example of showing how they can morph to new challenges, learn from past failings, and incrementally make things better for their older adults who live in New
Orleans. I was talking with a friend of mine last night about this session, and she was telling me about her mother who lived on the 10th floor in a high-rise in New York during Sandy and couldn't, my friend had to bring food up to her. Her mother couldn't get out for about a week.
Thank God she had a daughter nearby who was doing that. I mean, those kinds of, I'll be honest, you don't see many of those stories in the paper after Hurricane Sandy, that we know that they exist, but they're not reported because we don't like to talk about older adults. We don't like to talk about aging. So I feel like those stories kind of get shunted to the side, and it's at our own peril that we aren't talking about those kinds of failures more.
So if you were consulting with a city who wanted to build a climate resilient community, what would be the first steps you'd suggest they take?
I would honestly say the first steps are to find out who your older adults are and where they live. I think, again, there's a very poor understanding of where older adults live, who they are, how they live, what their needs are. I think you can get at that in an aggregate way, but it's important to get it at the granular level so that you really understand where people are, what their needs are. And I think there's a lot of mechanisms to mobilize that kind of information. You could set up something called the Special Needs Registry, which invites people to sort of self-identify and say, I'm X number of years old, I live alone, I have an oxygen tank, and I have 3 pets. And just know that if you're coming to evacuate me, I got a whole bunch of stuff that you're going to need to be attending to. That's a great example of beginning to customize the needs and use the needs of older adults to center response. But I think there's other mechanisms too. You can use faith-based groups, you can use community groups, you can use schools, you can use neighborhood associations to help rally older adults and get them involved in resilience planning. I think, by inviting older adults into being a part of the solution, you also are empowering them with information and connection in ways that can help them down the road. So, I would say for a local leader, start with an explicit desire to understand who their older adults are, what their needs are, where they live, and to leverage the existing sort of social groups that are out there, the social constructs that we have out there to both get that information and then to use those groups. And again, think about like the Meals on Wheels groups or those home-based care delivery folks, the visiting nurses or or other groups that, church groups, youth groups that are supporting older adults, use those groups as ways of both understanding older adults' needs and getting information to them about climate change and their risks.
And
Could I
go ahead.
could,
Go
can I
ahead, Ken.
just butt in and ask a question about a specific a growing population of older people who are the older homeless,
Mhm.
who are uniquely vulnerable. You talked about heat
Absolutely.
in Phoenix.
Yeah,
Those were the people who died more than
it's
anyone else, and a hard population to track and
very hard. Yeah,
serve.
I agree, and I think what's most disheartening about that is to see the rapid growth rate in the number of older adults who are homeless and unhoused. And I go back to that Ventura example. Let's say a third of the 500 households were older adults. If those people cannot find resources to fix their homes, they will become unhoused. They will join that unhoused population. And so you have to go back upstream really from what is displacing people. There was a New York Times article just last week that said 2.5 million Americans were displaced from climate change in a year. And that may be temporary, but that's a lot of displacement, and older adults are not well equipped always to bounce back from that. And so, yes, the risk to unhoused older adults absolutely are far more acute and require special attention in a whole bunch of ways, not the least of which is because of climate change risk.
I was just at a talk on Monday by Professor Gary Painter, who's now at the University of Cincinnati, I think. He was down in Southern California, but he is actually looking at the issues of unhoused among the elderly.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it funny that I'm hearing these conversations all together. He actually was talking about how many elderly people are displaced from their homes for things like, and he mentioned climate change, like, they can't afford to fix their house. They can't afford to, pay for insurance. So we're hearing a little bit about it.
Yeah. It's really, again, I go back to that number of older adults who are housing cost burden. If they are that financially frail, I'll use the word, financially vulnerable, then they can't afford a big insurance term. They can't afford utility bills that triple or quadruple in the hot season. They can't afford to fix their homes after disasters. And then, you've got local officials who are coming in, doing their job, enforcing home quality standards, ticketing people, citing them for being unable to maintain their homes, which just adds to the financial burden. And there are very few resources to help people in that situation. And again, for older adults who have all of their retirement savings or most of their savings locked up in the value of their home, once that home is damaged, that value is gone and they lose all of those savings. Yeah.
As someone who lives in earthquake country, very well aware.
You get it.
So we've been talking a lot about what communities can do. What can individuals do for themselves to, sort of improve their own resiliency?
Yeah. I mean, I do, I in my talks, generally when I'm summarizing the book, I say that I have three big takeaways from writing the book. One is that we have to acknowledge that older adults are uniquely at risk. We have to, two, accept the limitations of individual and institutional preparedness. And three, we need to really lean into community resilience. And on that second note, what can individuals do? There certainly is a role for individual preparedness. We all have an obligation to prepare ourselves for a future filled with more risk. That means, and again, I mentioned the fact that there are more tools out there than ever before that can help you project what the risks are in the community where you live. What can individuals do? They can educate themselves on what are the climate risks that they are likely to encounter. Some of that is thinking back on what's the past has been, but frankly, the past is not prologue anymore. It's really looking at what the data says, what the science says about the risks in this community and getting a handle on what that means for your ability to get out of harm's way or to prepare yourself to withstand those risks. And that I would also say, have those conversations with your caregiver, with your medical provider about how a power outage for a week might impact your ability to remain healthy, or if you had to miss dialysis appointments for a week because the transportation system shut down, what does that mean for your care? Are there alternatives? What are the sort of workarounds, or what other considerations do you both need to have in designing a care plan, keeping in mind the fact that there are risks out there that may occur? So a lot of it is, I'll go back to sort of education and preparedness, but then as a society, I think we need to acknowledge that we're never going to get there with just individual preparedness. We just can't. That, the magnitude of challenges, the complexity of these challenges, particularly for someone who's providing care for a spouse who's got Alzheimer's, or maybe caring for an adult child who's got disabilities, or who's mobility impaired themselves, or who's living alone themselves with dementia. There are just very real limitations to what some people can do to be prepared. And so we need to really shore up our commitment to community resilience as a result.
Circling back a bit to where we started, how do we engage particularly older adults in this topic? And I ask because I often see headlines saying older adults don't really care about climate change because they're not going to be around to have it impact them.
I would say for every one of those, there's maybe one or two that say this is the issue of my lifetime, and I really care about the world that I'm leaving behind for my kids or grandkids, and I want to get involved. So, groups like Third Act, led by Bill McKibben, and a lot of these other activist groups have surged in part because older adults, in many cases, feel very driven to engage in climate change. So, engage older adults certainly who already care about the issue. Let them be part of the solution. Help them educate others and be part of resilience planning, because they can best channel what their needs are and the needs of their cohort is. For those who aren't yet there, I think it is a way of. I strongly believe that sort of the aging world has a really important role to play, and I think heretofore the aging world has not seen climate change as part of their business. I think they see that as they're working environmentalists or the emergency managers or someone else. We just can't we can't have that be the case anymore. And so I think the more that aging advocacy groups, the more that people who serve older adults, the more the area agencies on aging and researchers begin to see climate as integral to their work, the better off we'll be, because those are the trusted resources that are serving older adults and that are reaching older adults. So for those organizations, pick up the book, educate yourself about what some of these risks are, have discussions and your teams about what are the impediments to delivering care or implementing the policies that you're considering against those known risks now that we know are coming. Are there any lessons we can learn from what COVID and how we sort of navigated COVID, which really started a discussion about older people and younger people? Yeah, I think, well, I'll start with the darkest lesson learned, which is we view older adults as expendable. We are okay with highly disproportionate death rates among adults. That is the real lesson learned from COVID, is that the overwhelming majority of people who died were older adults, and that was something that we were okay with as a community, as a society, which is tragic. On a more positive note, I think there were a lot of structures and processes and programs put in place to reach some of those isolated people who maybe hadn't been as seen before. I distinctly recall when I was at AARP, we took it upon ourselves, and I'll credit my boss at the time, to initiate a volunteer program where we would allow older adults who we communicate with we communicate with older adults with Social Security, and, fraud and lots of other issues. And we said, if you're having difficulty getting signed up for vaccines, let us know. So we had thousands of people signed up. We kind of split the task into phone lists of 10 person each, and we all got on the call, got on the phone, and literally called older adults to help them sign up for vaccine appointments, because in many cases they didn't have in-home internet. They were completely overwhelmed by the technology that was required. They didn't understand, in some cases, the folks I talked to, what it meant to set up a password and a username, why they had to do that before. Just all the things that we don't think about as barriers became real barriers to people to get appointments. And then, of course, were they able to land an appointment? Then they had to figure out how to get there. Was how they don't drive anymore. Their son only comes to visit once a month. How do I make these two things work? So I tell that story by way of saying we found a way to get people the help they needed then. That raised a lot of awareness, I think, with organizations and institutions about people who had been isolated, who remain isolated. And I think that some of those lessons can be applied to solve these problems too.
Ken, you wanted to?
Well, yeah, so let me ask one question. So I'll be also the chief time watcher. I'll ask a quick question, Martha, if you don't mind sort of having one more question after that, and then we will. So I wanted to ask you, Danielle, about the role that the media plays in this. When I think about sort of coverage of big climate events, I tend to think about focus on the storm, about people who are consciously deciding to stay as opposed to people who don't seem to have a choice.
Yeah, it's a little bit of victim blaming.
What's your experience with that? Yeah.
I get so frustrated by that. I really want to, I don't mean to name names, but there's a very famous writer who works for the New York Times who writes about climate all the time. And I would love it if he were just to take a moment and focus on this issue. And I've made, some small efforts to reach him and try and get him to think about this. The media has a huge role to play in terms of telling these stories. I think sometimes when the stories are told, it can be, the feel-good stories of isn't it wonderful that the son came and found their mother who was drowning in Hurricane Ida and was able to evacuate her. Isn't that wonderful? But they don't go and that's great. It's a great story to tell. But they don't go the next step, just say, why did this happen? Why, what is it about this woman, and how might that be indicative of a growing share of our communities and their needs? I don't know how to help us as a country break through that other than to keep yammering about this topic to anyone who will listen, and invite others to yammer about this topic to anyone who will listen, with the hopes that it will become something that we talk about more as a society.
Right. So I'm going to ask you the last question, which is from the audience. People are really engaged with this, Danielle, and they want to know how to reach you if you're willing to be reached. I'm
happy to be reached. I can put it in the chat. My work email is I won't even bother. darigoni@nhteinc.org. I will also say I have a little website that I sometimes use to try and post where I'll be talking and that's resilienceforanagingnation.com. And that also has my I'll put in the oh, there we go. Thank you, Kate. She typed out my email and I just dropped in the website. Either of those ways are good ways to reach me, and I'd love to talk to people. As I said, I'm happy to talk to anybody about this issue at any time because I feel really passionate, and I'm really grateful that y'all took the time to focus on it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Your passion comes through, and it's a wonderful conversation, a hard conversation, right? But thank you for elucidating it and for taking it on. Producer Kate, in addition to providing the email, has put links in the chat where you can buy this important book. And I think Danielle's publisher has also given a special discount code as an extra incentive.
Yeah.
And I hope everyone will join us for future longevity book club events. We actually got a great set of books. It'll be hard to top this conversation, but we'll try. Next up will be Carolyn Paul, the best-selling author of a new book called Tough Broad, From Boogie Boarding to Wing Walking, How Outdoor Adventures Improves Our Lives as We Age. That'll be on April 2nd. On May 1st, we'll be joined by Andrew Scott of the London Business School to talk about his new book, The Longevity Imperative. And then June 6th will be Maddie Dockwald talking about Ageless Aging, A Woman's Guide to Better Health Span, Brain Span, and Lifespan. Kate will be putting registration links in the chat. I hope you will all join us then. Thank you for coming today, and thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Martha.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.